He was born on a humid summer evening in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to parents who had migrated north in the Great Migration of the mid-20th century. His father, Leroy Johnson, was a bus mechanic who spent long nights repairing engines and long days commuting by carpool to work, while his mother, Selena, juggled shifts as a nurse's aide and caring for their three children. From the start, he learned that life was not a series of given entitlements, but an ongoing negotiation with a world that often judged people by the color of their skin rather than the contents of their character. As the youngest of the three siblings, he, Jordan, watched his older brother Marcus and sister Angela face daily indignities: the suspicious stares on the playground, the brusque disregard of teachers, the occasional taunts in the grocery store aisle. He remembered how Angela once came home at age 10, tears in her eyes, because a classmate had circled her on a school picture day form and written "nigger" above her face. He sat on the floor of their small living room, surrounded by Selena's prayer cards and Leroy's model engines, and pressed his forehead against her knees as she tried to comfort him. "People are just ignorant," she told him gently, smoothing the hair from his brow. "But we must keep our heads high and our hearts brave." Jordan carried those early lessons with him as he grew tall and lean, his stride confident on the schoolyard, his laughter easy even when a teacher complained he called out too much. He was a number 1 student in every subject, particularly history, where he discovered how the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow were not just distant relics, but lived experiences that shaped every corner of American life. In his sophomore year, he joined the debate team and found his voice, arguing passionately about issues of social justice and constitutional rights. Yet with every round of applause, he felt a tingling unease. Did people applaud the ideas or the novelty of hearing a black teenager deliver them? He resolved to become an attorney one day, believing that the law could be wielded as a tool for equity rather than oppression. In his senior year at McKinley High, he held office as student government president, organized bake sales and book drives for underfunded elementary schools, and led a voter registration drive at local churches. When a white classmate, John Carmichael, sneered that he should focus on sports instead of politics, Jordan's reply, "My mind is my muscle," echoed through the cafeteria long after, earning him admirers who respected his poise even in the face of derision. The school principal, Ms. Talbot, encouraged him to apply for a scholarship to Howard University, and he did, earning a full ride that launched him to Washington, D.C. that autumn. On his hazy first morning at Howard, he walked the campus with his suitcase as the red and black banners of the Bison waved in the breeze. Beneath the keystone arch of Founders Library, he felt the legacy of the many civil rights leaders who had walked before him. He touched the cool granite and whispered, "I will make you proud." Collegiate life broadened his horizons. In his freshman dorm room, he met a circle of classmates who would become lifelong friends. Malik, a poet who carried a notebook in every pocket; Denise, a future physician with a fiery dedication to public health; and Intera, an international student from Ghana studying environmental law. Together, they attended spirited lectures from professors who had marched with Dr. King, organized free tutoring for children in Anacostia, and marched in protests against South African apartheid. Jordan majored in political science, minored in African American studies, and wrote a thesis on the influence of black-led grassroots movements on federal legislation. He spent summers interning with the ACLU in New York, wandering the red-bricked streets of Harlem with court papers in his bag, assisting in cases challenging discriminatory policing practices. He learned to draft memos, cross-examine witnesses, and sift through endless mountains of case law. Each night he returned to his little dorm cubicle and stayed up until dawn, combing through the ACLU's archive of landmark decisions. In his third year, on a blistering June afternoon, he was arrested for the first time. He and a group of friends, Malik, Denise, and 2 others, had decided to walk to Central Park's reservoir for a weekend picnic. They had driven from campus to the subway station, boarded the train, and emerged into the midday heat. The park was crowded with tourists, joggers, families, and students. Surrounded by a sea of white faces and colored ones, they spread towels on the grass. Malik recited his latest poem, and Denise passed out sandwiches. Jordan handed out cold sodas. It was exactly the kind of ordinary afternoon he loved, until 2 plainclothes officers approached them, badges flashing. Jordan had seen the same scenario countless times on television. Black men stopped for no apparent reason beyond their skin. He muttered, "What's going on?" as the officers demanded identification. "Why are you here?" the first officer asked, arms folded. He was a man in his mid-40s, complexion fair, blue eyes unreadable. The other officer, younger, arm hovering above his taser, glared at Jordan's friends. "You look suspicious to us. You're out walking. That's not normally done in this neighborhood." Jordan opened his eyes wide. "Walking? With my sneakers on? We took the subway over 3 stops. We're students. Here for a picnic in the park. We have no idea what you're talking about." He raised his hand slightly so the officer could see that he held no weapons. The first officer patted his right knee in his pockets, overturning a crumpled napkin and a digital SLR camera. He looked up and sneered. "You'll want to put that away. We can't have photos taken here. It's a crime." The camera had a visible press sticker on it. Malik intervened. "He's a student journalist. He has press credentials," he said, stepping between Jordan and the officer. The officers ignored this. By then, a small crowd had gathered, curious and unsettled. "Are you resisting?" the officer asked harshly. Before Jordan could respond, his arms pinioned behind him. He felt the sharp jab of handcuffs cutting into his wrists and a surge of adrenaline as the second officer shoved his head down. "Walking while black," the officer muttered to his partner. Malik tried to film with his phone. The second officer struck him forcefully across the hand. Denise screamed, "Let him go!" and the officer threatened her with dereliction of duty. Jordan's ears rang as they marched him to a squad car parked on 107th Street. The camera rolled on Malik's phone as the crowd hissed at the officers, calling out, "Why? And you're harassing students!" Through the window, Jordan saw his friends exchange stunned glances. The door slammed. The squad car pulled away with its lights off, leaving them in the dusty park, dust, and stunned silence. He was taken to the 28th Precinct, a dingy brick building that reeked of sweat and despair. They threw him into a cramped holding cell with a single, flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. He heard the distant clang of metal doors, the muffled shouts of other detainees. His wrists stung fiercely. He took a deep breath, trying not to panic. He was a law-abiding citizen, top student, volunteer at the food pantry. There was no reason for this. As the hours passed, he was interrogated by a detective's assistant, who seemed more interested in his home address than the circumstances of his arrest. Eventually, he was fingerprinted, his information run through the system, then processed for a charge of loitering and resisting arrest. He was released on his own recognizance early the next morning. The group of student journalists from school who had been alerted by Malik's video took turns hugging him outside the precinct. He walked out across the sidewalk with his brown paper bag of personal belongings, the brutal sun low in the sky. A line of cabs shuttled passengers downtown, unaware of the injustice that had unfolded mere feet away. Jordan's family learned of his arrest via a friend's phone call. His mother's voice quivered in disbelief. "How could they do this, baby? You did nothing wrong." His father was pragmatic. "We'll deal with this. Get home safe." But the damage was done. Over the next week, campus newspapers and social media platforms carried clips of Malik's video. The squad car peeling away, the flickering cell camera shot of Jordan's face pressed against the wall before the cuffs pulled him into darkness. Opinion pieces in the local press decried overzealous policing. Young activists began posting online about standing in solidarity with Walking While Black. A Change.org petition demanding the officer's suspension and official apology garnered tens of thousands of signatures. The ACLU took up his case to file a civil suit against the police department. Under mounting pressure, the Commission of Police announced an internal investigation. One of the officers was reassigned to desk duty. The district attorney's office dismissed the charges for lack of evidence and for demonstrable misconduct. Jordan's record was expunged, but he came away with a sense of indignation that would haunt him. He returned to Howard University's campus, bearing the bruises on his wrists as a badge of shame, and the viral video on his phone as proof that black lives could be rendered disposable by those sworn to protect. He threw himself into activism. In the semester that followed, he led the campus chapter of the National Black Law Students Association, organized protest vigils in front of the dean's office, and partnered with local churches to host Know Your Rights workshops. He spoke frequently at community forums, where he recounted the indignity and trauma of walking while black. He served as a witness to sorrowed families whose sons had been killed by over-aggressive force. He traveled to Ferguson, Missouri in the summer of 2014 during the protests sparked by Michael Brown's death, standing in the heat while tear gas and rubber bullets peppered the air. He met with activists and shared strategies for unifying protests, tracking police misconduct, and leveraging social media for national coverage. He returned to campus that fall, resolved to become a civil rights attorney who would draft policies, file challenges, and fight for the structural change that would prevent other young black men from silenced strolls turning into violent confrontations. After graduating with honors from Howard's Law School, he secured a clerkship with the Southern District U.S. Court of Appeals in New Orleans. While he admired the experience, he found the judiciary's pace too slow. He wanted action. He declined an offer from a large corporate law firm and instead accepted a fellowship at the Southern Center for an Educational Equity in Atlanta, where he helped litigate cases about unequal school funding and disparities in disciplinary actions against students of color. He worked long days in a cramped office, drafting complaints, reviewing discovery documents, and preparing for depositions. He was invigorated by witnessing how evidence-based arguments could force reluctant school boards to redirect resources toward underfunded districts, reduce suspension rates, and implement restorative justice programs. By night, he penned essays for The Atlantic and Ebony, reflecting on the intersections of race, law, and policy. He critiqued the school-to-prison pipeline and called for community control over policing. Each column cemented his reputation as a thoughtful, incisive advocate for racial justice. At the same time, he stayed connected to grassroots efforts. On weekends, he rode buses back to Baton Rouge to support local organizers who opposed stop-and-frisk expansions in black neighborhoods. And he appeared on campus in lectures and symposiums, inspiring young students to pursue legal careers focused on civil rights. In spring 2017, he was invited to testify at a U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on police transparency. Standing before a panel of senators, he recounted his own arrest, the ACLU's data showing racial disparities in stops, and the results of his school desegregation cases. His testimony was broadcast on C-SPAN, and viral clips of him standing at the lectern, his suit crisp, his posture adamant, spread across social media. His closing words reverberated. No young man should live in fear, simply because his skin color is seen as a threat. Policing must protect all citizens equally, not target those who already bear the burden of systemic bias. Senators nodded, and at least two introduced bills aimed at instituting national standards for police data reporting. Upon returning to Atlanta, he found his inbox flooded with invites to join task forces, deliver commencement addresses, and consult on state legislation. He declined most of the vanity requests, choosing instead to focus on partnering with the Georgia Legislative Black Caucus on a comprehensive police reform bill. The bill called for mandatory de-escalation training, real-time open-access data on stops and use-of-force incidents, establish civilian review boards with subpoena power, require officers to activate body cameras, and create independent prosecutors. For officer-involved shootings, he coordinated with governor's aides, civil liberties groups, and families of victims to ensure the bill addressed real-life concerns. He traveled to rural towns and urban centers alike, holding town halls, listening to fisherfolk in the Okefenokee Swamp share distrust of sheriff's deputies, and meeting with civil rights elders who remembered the days of unmasked brutality. Each conversation sharpened his resolve. Law without compassion was mere paperwork. Policy without community buy-in was empty rhetoric. The legislature adopted a watered-down version of the bill by a narrow margin in spring 2018. It mandated body cameras and civilian review boards, but omitted the independent prosecutor provision and allowed local discretion on data reporting, frequency. Despite imperfections, Jordan celebrated. The measure marked the first serious police reform in Georgia in decades. He held a press conference with two chairs of the Black Caucus, Police Chief Williams from Columbus, and a mother from Macon whose son had been shot at the wrong house. He called it a first step toward accountability, a beacon for other states to follow. He reminded everyone that reform was an ongoing process, not a single event. He described it as an iterative movement, requiring vigilance, courage, and the moral clarity to see beyond politics. Meanwhile, his career soared. He founded the nonprofit Justice Equity Network, JEN, staffed by a small team of attorneys, data analysts, and community organizers. JEN's mission was national in scope: compile and analyze state-by-state policing data, produce annual police accountability scorecards, and issue legislative toolkits for advocates. In the Edison, New Jersey office that once housed only a beat-up sofa and his laptop, Jen now occupied a modest, open-plan workspace, its walls tattooed with maps showing reform progress in California, Minnesota, Texas, and beyond. A large mural of Martin Luther King Jr.'s silhouette dominated the main hallway, and a corkboard displayed letters from families Jen had helped. A mother whose son, incarcerated since age 16, had received a reduced sentence under a Jen-supported state law, a father whose daughter survived a police shooting and had received a civilian review hearing message of apology and oversight changes. The team also ran training programs, immersive workshops for prosecutors, public defenders, and elected officials on racial bias, risk assessment protocols, and community-based alternatives to policing. In November 2019, the nation's attention turned to Minneapolis after the death of George Floyd under the knee of a police officer. Protests flared in hundreds of cities. Jen's headquarters became a command center. Screens tracked protests in real time, showing where checkpoints clashed with crowds, where calls for independent investigations had been echoed by governors and mayors. Jordan worked around the clock, appearing on CNN, MSNBC, and BBC to clarify the legal pathways for fast-tracking charges against officers, encourage governors to activate civilian oversight bodies, and advise mayors on allocating emergency funding to crisis intervention teams. He consulted state attorneys general on how to convene special grand juries and recommended Minnesota protocol guidelines for investigating deaths in custody. As news anchors sought his voice to explain complex statutes and intergovernmental processes, he realized media appearances were still a tool. Through them, he could reach millions with evidence-based arguments for structural change. Amid the media whirlwind, he also remembered that reform needed to be rooted in local relationships. He traveled to Minneapolis, kneeling in solidarity at an encampment near the 3rd Precinct, listening to residents who had endured decades of targeting and disinvestment. He joined community forums in Atlanta's Cascade Heights, where mothers wept for their children whose arrests seemed inevitable. He organized weekly webinars, connecting local activists from Portland to Philadelphia, creating a coalition sharing resources, best practices, and model ordinances. He watched as city councils in Detroit, Louisville, and Richmond began to introduce legislation that bore Jen's fingerprints, commitments to demilitarize police forces, invest in mental health crisis teams, and ban no-knock warrants. By early 2020, Jen had grown into a major force, a staff of 50, state offices in 8 regions, and a significant endowment from philanthropic grants. Jordan traveled constantly, speaking before lawmakers, testifying at congressional hearings, and convening summits. Yet he still felt the same fire as that hot June morning in Central Park. He often recalled how he had been told he was walking while black, as though strolling innocently in a public space was a crime. That indignity had catalyzed his mission, transforming personal injustice into public advocacy. He penned an op-ed in the New York Times, "From walking while black to legislating while just," charting his path from that first arrest to national prominence. He wrote, "There was nothing remarkable about my walk, nothing undoctrinally ominous. My only mistake was existing in a space that imagined my presence as a threat. Now, my work is to dismantle the myths that treat young black men as suspects before they are suspects. We must recast public safety as an inclusive enterprise, not a fortress guarding privileged lives from those deemed other." That fall, he accepted a position as a visiting professor of criminal justice reform at Georgetown University Law Center. Each Monday, he commuted into D.C., standing before a classroom of law students, many of whom had grown up in different parts of the city, to challenge them with case studies, the differential outcomes of federal sentencing guidelines, the constitutional limits on stop and frisk policies, and the methods for crafting legislation that could survive constitutional scrutiny while making meaningful impact. He oversaw moot court competitions, where students argued fictitious cases about predictive policing algorithms biased against communities of color. Watching them grapple with the tension between police autonomy and civil rights, he felt a rush of hope. Those future lawyers would carry the torch forward. In December 2021, as the world grappled with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic that had exacerbated inequities, Jordan was invited to the White House to advise on the president's task force on 21st century policing. In the Oval Office, he sat across from the Attorney General and the Director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, COPS office, laying out a roadmap, tie federal grants to compliance with revamped use of force guidelines, require states receiving funding to adopt model policies on racial bias training, and create a federal rapid response team to intervene in jurisdictions facing acute disparities. The room grew quiet as he spoke, though he could detect the pen scribbling notes and the gravity in the Attorney General's eyes. It was both surreal and expected. A boy once cuffed unjustly in Central Park, now seated in the highest echelons of policymaking. When the meeting concluded, the president himself approached, shook Jordan's hand firmly, and said, "Thanks to you, we'll have a chance to turn promises of reform into real progress." Jordan nodded, pride and purpose surging through him, but he did not rest. In 2022, the midterm elections ushered in a new wave of governors and local officials. Jen pivoted to building a state reform consortium, partnering with local grassroots organizations in Florida, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Their goal was to draft and pass state-level omnibus criminal justice reform acts, addressing sentencing disparities, bail reform, expanded oversight, and expansion of restorative justice courts. Each of these efforts required boots on the ground, traveling through sweltering summers in Tallahassee, meeting with retired sheriffs who were open to common-sense changes, and holding press conferences with families who had lost loved ones to officer-involved shootings. Jordan often spoke of how reform was not a one-size-fits-all. It required local nuance, cultural intelligence, and unwavering resolve. Back in his own life, he faced personal challenges: long nights on red-eye flights, the strain of balancing his role as a father to newborn twins. His wife, Bridget, a pediatrician, delivered their son and daughter in the spring of 2021, and mentoring the next generation of activists. His mother, Selena, fell ill with kidney failure and moved in with him and Bridget in a small house in Silver Spring. He spent weekends learning to administer dialysis from a visiting nurse, all while writing his second book, a memoir titled Becoming Unbroken: From Walking While Black to Rewriting the Law. It chronicled his life from that humiliating arrest to the halls of power, interlaced with historical context about the long struggle for equality. A story meant to inspire lawyers, activists, and everyday citizens alike. He wrote through tears and triumphs, knowing that telling his story could encourage others to stand when they were told to be silent. In August 2023, the Supreme Court agreed to hear a pair of major cases challenging qualified immunity protections for officers accused of civil rights violations. Jordan was called to testify before the court's Bar Association, offering his perspective on how qualified immunity had shielded officers from accountability, even in cases of blatant misconduct. His words, measured yet impassioned, echoed in the grand marble chamber. He urged the court to recalibrate the balance between officer protection and individual rights. Qualified immunity was meant to protect reasonable mistakes, not to bury deliberate wrongdoing. We cannot allow the standard to become so insurmountable that victims of constitutional violations are left without recourse. The judges listened intently, and the oral arguments that followed became a flashpoint in the national debate. When the decision was announced the following year, the court had significantly narrowed qualified immunity, making it easier for civil rights litigants to pursue claims. Jordan stood outside the building, watching the ticker tick down the final vote tally, tears of gratitude running down his cheeks. By 2024, he had become a fixture on late-night talk shows and national panels. The reform movement he had sparked, once confined to campus debates and local hearings, had gone mainstream. A bipartisan coalition of governors had launched a federal commission to standardize use of force protocols, drawing heavily on Jen's research and policy recommendations. His face appeared on magazine covers, Time's 100 Most Influential People, Ebony's Icons of Justice, and The Root's Civil Rights Vanguard. But despite the accolades, he remained grounded. At Jen's annual retreat, his staff gathered under a canopy of oaks at a retreat center in Shenandoah Park. At the closing banquet, he asked everyone to raise a glass of water, coffee, or whiskey, and reminded them, "None of this is about me. It's about the mother whose son still sleeps with one eye open, the teacher who wants her students to learn rather than be punished. It's about all of us who believe that an informed, engaged community can call our leaders to account. So tonight we raise a glass to each other because the work continues. We never rest." They cheered, and the amber glow of strings of lights in the pavilion glinted off tearful faces. And so, Jordan's journey progressed, each year a new chapter of activism and impact. But one late December evening, after a long Christmas volunteer shift distributing warm clothes to unhoused families, he sat in his study and reflected on how a single arrest, an experience meant to humiliate him and reinforce a narrative of criminality, had instead catalyzed a life spent seeking justice. It struck him that systemic racism was like concentric circles, radiating outward from that first stop, affecting a family's security, a community's trust, and an entire nation's conscience. Yet he also understood that justice could ripple outward in similar fashion, from a single voice crying out in the streets to a law reshaping institutions, to a generation of young advocates, understanding that too loud was often the precursor to progress. He placed his hands on the spines of his first memoir and his newly finished manuscript, smiling softly. "We are unbroken," he whispered, "and we carry the voices of the silence to make them heard." On January 15, 2025, the world watched as he took the stage at the National Conference on Criminal Justice Reform in Chicago. Flanked by a diverse panel of sheriffs, legislators, and survivors, the Illinois State Journal displayed his photo on the front page. From arrest to advocate, how one man's stride in Central Park changed a nation. As he spoke about bridging the gap between law enforcement and communities of color, about building trust through transparency, empathy, and genuine accountability, he felt the same conviction he had felt the day he refused to step aside in Central Park. He was no longer a walking statistic. He had become a walking testament to resilience, empathy, and the transformative power of a single person's refusal to accept injustice. When he concluded to a standing ovation, children from the community theater troupe performed a short play on stage, depicting young activists passing a torch from one generation to the next. Their faces were full of hope, their lines earnest and bright. "We are the future," they declared, "and we will keep walking, everywhere with pride." Jordan stood just beyond the stage, tears pricking his eyes as he watched them. In that moment, he realized that walking while black had taught him that a stride, an undeniable assertion of humanity, could spark a movement. Now, as he stepped off the platform to embrace his family, Bridget holding their two children, Marcus and Angela, and Selena and Leroy, in a living cloud of pride, he knew that he had done more than seat himself at tables of power. He had helped dismantle them where they oppressed and built new spaces where every person walking freely could be safe, respected, and beyond wrong. And so his story continued, never ending, always evolving. Written in the footsteps of those who walked before him and those who would walk after. Each stride a claim to justice, each voice a call to a future defined not by two different labels, but by collective determination for a fairer, more equitable nation.